Now let's talk about fenestration, and the definition of fenestration is basically skylights, windows, and doors. They're vertical windows or opaque doors, glazed block, a combination of opaque and glazed doors. These are all fall under the definition in the code for fenestration. Let's take a look at the NFRC label for a final review. First of all, the piece of information that we care a lot about with regards to fenestration is the U factor and the solar heat gain coefficient. So we need to have this rating, and it needs to be located on the window because an important part of the inspector determining whether the right product is being used. It is also important to recognize that when you look at the U factor table, it says that the U factor needs to be 0.35, whether it be new construction or replacement windows or less. Now that is an area weighted number. And it's important to recognize that not every specific window has to be 0.35 or less. It just means that the area weighted average has to be. So that when we average all the windows, the total average U factor of those windows has to be 0.35. So some could be slightly higher. That means that some would have to be slightly less in order to, meet that area weighted requirement. Now, there are some strict limits on that. That can't be traded off. So for example, when you're looking at climate zones 4, you can have an area weighted U factor of greater than 0.48. So that means that in any of these trade-offs, you can only go so far. You can't have U factors greater than 0.48. Same thing for skylights. You can't have a greater U factor than 0.75. And again, these are based on a building average. Individual windows or skylights can be worse if the area weighted average meets these requirements. These hard limits also can impact res check and other performance pathways to compliance. Now let's talk about the prescriptive requirements for systems. So if we look at ducts, the requirement for attics, for example, is R8. Everywhere else, the requirement is R6. Building framing cavities, again, can't be used for supply ducts, but they can be used for return air ducts. Not recommended. With regards to prescriptive requirements, it's important to know with regards to systems, the HVAC furnace efficiencies and air conditioning efficiencies, they're set by federal standards. So for example, the minimum standard to manufacture a furnace is 78%, a boiler is 80%. You can't manufacture air conditioning equipment that's less than 13 SEER. That's not addressed in this portion of the code. However, for prescriptive requirements, ductwork certainly is. And so you have to have R8 as part of the prescriptive requirements for attics, and then everywhere else needs to be R6. And building framing cavities cannot be used for supply ducts, as we talked about earlier. In addition, it can be used for return air ducts, but certainly not recommended. All right, let's move to lighting. There is a lighting requirement, and basically applies to all permanently installed lighting fixtures. It requires that 50% of these lamps, these actual light bulbs, 50% of the bulbs have to be compact fluorescent or T8 linear or meet some minimum energy efficiency requirements. It applies to both interior and exterior lighting. So most of this can be met with CFLs, but remember, it's the lamps themselves, more than 50% have to be energy efficient, not the fixture. So if you have a fixture with a lot of incandescent bulbs in it, that can really throw things askew. So it's important that we recognize that 50% of the lamps have to be energy efficient. Compliance documentation inspections. Code officials inspections, they're definitely successive. They're final inspections and may even need re-inspection if necessary. And the code is valid. Code deemed to be illegal or void shall not affect the remainder of the code. And finally, fees must be paid before the permit is issued and required in accordance with the schedule.